This video is sponsored by Squarespace. I don't think I've ever seen Lewis Hamilton struggle more than he just did at the 2024 Brazilian Grand Prix. Baku 2022 was bone shaking down the straight, but he still pulled out a P4 finish. Bahrain 2008, he dropped from P3 to P13, but he did get his front wing broken early doors. Spain 2013, he dropped like a stone after qualifying well, but it was his first year at a pre-hybrid Mercedes. He was still finding his feet. But Brazil 2024, I mean, Lewis said it best himself. Yesterday was terrible, today was terrible, qualifying was bad, the sprint was bad. Who'd have thought things could get even worse than the W13 days in 2022? A car that Toto said they'd put on display in the factory as a reminder. Well, Lewis just labelled the W15 at Interlagos the worst car I've ever driven. Damn. So how did we get here? Why such a painful end to Lewis's career at the Silver Arrows? In a car that he still managed to win 2 races in this season, by the way. Yet in the race just gone, Lewis is having an absolute howler. Yet if George Russell gets a bit more lucky with the red flag timing, mainly his team actually listens to him, then he could have won the whole thing. It doesn't make sense. And most importantly, what's next for Lewis? Can he really bounce back at Ferrari? Or is this slump in form actually a sign of things to come? Well, my name's Tomo. Let's talk about it. Lewis shocked the world back in February when he dropped the news he'd be departing Mercedes, a team and organisation that supported him since McLaren picked him up at 13 years of age and was finally pulling off the dream move to the Scuderia. Now look, this ground effect era has not come easy to Mercedes. Lewis lost his streak of winning every single year at least one Grand Prix in 2022. 2023 was better, a step forward, 6 podiums to his name, and he convincingly outscored George Russell. But Max of course dominated harder than anyone has probably dominated ever in this sport. Lewis's best sniff at a win was probably Austin, wasn't it, when he actually got disqualified in the end for excessive plank wear. Now Lewis has flirted with the idea of a Ferrari move many a time in his career. He's put statements out, he's said things, and it's all been like in jest, and you think, yeah, that would be cool, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. It is happening. Mercedes are in a slump and are showing no consistent sign, certainly weren't when he announced he was going to Ferrari, that they've got on top of this ground effect era. Fourth best car is not where he wants to be at the twilight of his career. He'll be 40 when the 2025 season starts. And of course Ferrari came out of the gate strong in 2022. Yes, they slumped back in 2023, but when Lewis made this decision, it was a risk, and benefit of hindsight, it's looking like a worldie, a pearler of a risk, because Ferrari are looking like they could go into 2025 as a favourite. I mean, the hype of how competitive it should be at the front alone for 2025 is good enough. You add Lewis in red, I can't wait. Look, for Lewis to make it to Formula 1 at all, his story speaks for itself from very relative humble beginnings, of course, compared to most Formula 1 drivers. Not to mention the additional racial barriers he's had to overcome along the way. I mean, just watch back him speaking when he was like, 11, 12 years old, and it's heartbreaking, to be honest. But Lewis has done so much for the sport. Of course, he is stepping in at McLaren alongside a 2-time world champion in Fernando Alonso and going toe-to-toe straight out the blocks. Making the gamble to join Mercedes from McLaren that at the time felt like a bit of a weird downstep, and of course it paid off massively for him. 2014 to 2020 really did belong to Lewis, really, didn't it? I know Rosberg won his title and Vettel got close, but Lewis seemed to just have this stranglehold on the top tier competitiveness of the sport, and to still be able to win races after 17 years at 39 years of age. Like, you don't have to like Lewis to acknowledge that that's pretty impressive. But what about his current slump in form? Well, I think the first thing you should look at really is the hardware, the car underneath him, because that W15 has been far from smooth sailing. Unlike today's video sponsor Squarespace, which makes it an absolute breeze to build your own beautiful online home. Unlike the W15, Squarespace is a reliable, multifaceted tool that always delivers. Now with their all-new design intelligence program built in, it's easier than ever to bring your ideas to life with the help of Squarespace AI-supported tools. Whether you're a business owner, blogger, or you just want a place to showcase your portfolio, which is what I've used Squarespace for years. Plus my online store, TOMMO'SRacingGoods.com. Watch this space, something's coming very soon. It's free to try and only bills you when you want to put your website live to the world. So when that moment inevitably, because I know it will, when that moment comes around, head to squarespace.com/TommoF1 to get 10% off of your very first website or domain. I'm pretty sure I've got a good idea how 42% of the comments in this video will look. 21% will claim passionately with absolute certainty that it's entirely down to the car being rubbish and the team actively working against Lewis for whatever reason. I can't even think of one. And then another 21% will claim actively with absolute certainty he's just washed and was never that good anyway. He's been exposed for the fraud that he is. Look, people love an absolute take, right? Nuance is complicated and requires some thinking. No, let's just go for the extreme. Look, when you take back from most things in life and actually look at it objectively, the truth is somewhere in the middle. So then how much of this slump is down to the car and how much is down to the driver? Well, look, in short, I don't know. And you don't know. No one knows. Mercedes don't know. I don't even think Lewis knows. Look, throughout the ground effect regulations, that car has continually struggled to extract consistent aerodynamic performance from its floor. The zero pod concept was initially conceived in the wind tunnel as the optimal theoretical way of going about ground effects. But then they put the car on a real track with real bumps, real scrapes, a real life racing circuit, and things quickly fell apart, right? They hadn't considered the suspension element, which of course Newey and Red Bull had and is a big part of why they did so well. The wild swings in performance from the W13, 14, 15, I think all come from this fundamentally flawed initial attempt. And it's really hard to undo that in a cost cap era where all your expenses are limited. You can't just spend like crazy like a Mercedes of old would have done and developed multiple different car concepts. You can't do that anymore. The zero pods may be gone visually anyway, but their legacy lives on. And it's also important to remember that it's not only Lewis who's not happy about the car. George has had his fair share of struggles as well. And even a weekend like Brazil, where again on another day he could have won that race, that thing was shaking his spine loose in FP1 as well. I mean, 2024 has been a series of just one-off worldies for George and Lewis respectively. Sometimes they're both quick, like in Spa. Sometimes Lewis is and George isn't, like in Hungary. Sometimes George is and Lewis isn't, like in Brazil, just gone. And sometimes neither of them are there at all, really. Kind of like in Japan. Suzuka was pretty nasty. But it does seem to me, at least, that George is more able to drive around the problems inherent to this W15. When the car's being a diva, he seems to be more able to get on top of it. When the car's playing ball, certainly in race pace, Lewis, I think, does have a bit of an advantage. However, more often than not, it doesn't seem to be all quite there. It seems to have a really, really narrow operating window that Mercedes really struggle to consistently get the car into. And look, why is that? I mean, look, listen, I'd be a rich man if I knew the answer, because Lewis put the hit out in Brazil, didn't he? If you can find the problem, I'll give you $1 million. I know he's good for it, so come on, get to work in the comments below. If you can find the problem, then we've got to try and find a way of getting in touch with Lewis. I'm sure I can work something out. Well, look, I think the first problem for Lewis is the guy on the other side of the garage. So let's start there. George Russell is really good. Possibly the most underestimated kind of top driver in Formula One. And I say that from, I think I'm guilty of underestimating him kind of completely, right? When I did my mid-season ratings, me putting George 7th, I think I put him 7th or 6th, I think it was 7th, best driver of the year so far, was lambasted in the comments. That was the one that got the most heat. And fair enough, on reflection, including this, second half of the season as well, I think he's really come into his own, and Mercedes team he's now kind of fully settled himself into and knows that he's going to be the guy leading that team forward, especially with a 18-year-old rookie jumping in the car next year. Sure, he has a shunty moment still in him, does George, but I think he's getting on top of it slowly but surely, kind of like Charles Leclerc. Charles Leclerc is incredible. He's had a shunty moment, but I think he's past that. George is a little bit behind, but he's getting there. George's one-lap pace, his wet weather ability, and honestly, I think he's like ballsy demeanour. I've got to say, I'd back George over Lando to go head-to-head with Max. I think I would. I'd love to see them two going at it a bit more. Just need Mercedes to give him the car for crying out loud. Mercedes is George's best bet for his long-term career, having been part of that academy since the early days. And the Toto-induced Verstappen rumours, right, flirting with him at every possible opportunity, should hopefully serve to light a fire up at George's rear end, right? Because Kimi Antonelli, if he does develop and does become that guy, I mean, 2026, if Max becomes available, 3 don't go into 2, do they? Maybe this is a strategy of Toto, and he always kind of played mind games with Valtteri, only giving him 1 year extensions. Maybe this is Toto's way of being like, oh god, I can't do a Toto Wolff impression. George, you need to go fast. Put that cookie down. George has just caught and overtaken Lewis only by 2 points in the Drivers' Championship, which in isolation doesn't really tell us anything. When you consider a couple of things, specifically the disqualification George had in Spa, where he just pulled off a chaotic strategy, which, you know, he could afford to try something risky. It worked, and then it, of course, didn't work. Well, Lewis got the win from that, so that's 25 points to Lewis, 0 for George. And of course, in Silverstone, George was firmly in contention for that race win as well. His car broke down, and Lewis won that, so that's another 25. It's basically a 50-0 swing Lewis's way through no fault of George's own, because it's not his fault that his car was set up too low and wore the plank too much. Yet even with that 50-0 point swing towards Lewis, George is still 2 points ahead, and I just think that speaks of George being just much more consistent over the course of this season. Now, one question we don't have the answer to, and we'll never have the answer to, and we'll never be able to measure it, is how much of this swing towards George is because Mercedes are being pragmatic and putting their eggs in the basket of Russell. Lewis isn't just leaving, he's leaving to a direct rival, so it's in their best interest. He takes as little intel and information that could compromise, you know, these two teams could be fighting for a constructors or even a driver's title next year. George versus Lewis has been pretty spicy at Mercedes. Imagine them two at different teams fighting with each other. Cinema, I didn't even think of that. That's quality. I think it's fairly normal for a driver to be quite skeptical in this position, right? You know you're going to a direct rival. He's been at that team for a long time. He's going to feel like he deserves a degree of loyalty. But again, the pragmatic choice for Mercedes is to prioritise George going forward. You can't begrudge them. It doesn't matter if you're a fan of Lewis or not. You've got to understand that Mercedes have a responsibility to themselves above any individual. And at the end of the day, Lewis made the decision to leave Mercedes. Crazy for Ferrari. Now, of course, as much as the team's approach towards the driver might change, it also goes both ways. And that's not just Lewis. This is the same with Esteban leaving Alpine for Haas, or Carlos leaving Ferrari for Williams. But Lewis is taking a step up, I think it's fair to say, to a competitive championship challenging team for next season, right? So that makes his move stand out a little bit. I mean, I think it's fair to say Mercedes have been the 4th best team in the ground effect era, whereas Ferrari again came out the blocks flying in 2022, stumbled a bit, have had, you know, change in management, but with Fred Vasseur at the helm and, you know, a new strategy team in there, they seem to just be crossing the T's and dotting the I's in a way that we've not seen from Ferrari for a pretty long time. I can completely imagine why it's difficult for Lewis to find that inner dog, right, in himself as a top tier athlete, arguably the greatest of all time, when he's at a team that's struggling, giving him a really inconsistent car, and he can see the team that he's going to next year doing bits and doing well. I mean, fair enough if he switches off a bit, and fair enough that he doesn't bend over backwards to fix Mercedes' problems, because that will just help Mercedes against him next year. Ferrari are giving Carlos Sainz a car that he can win races in, right? And he's going down to Williams, so it's important that he keeps his stock high. Lewis's stock is incredible. He doesn't need to really prove anything. This is the final move of his career, no question, whereas Sainz is potentially going to be looking for moves down the line. And certainly that's the kindest argument in favour of Lewis not having lost it and fallen off or whatever, that he is just coasting and he'll be back to top tier levels at Ferrari when he'll be super motivated, super on it, dedicated both consciously and subconsciously to dragging that team forward and potentially winning his 8th, right? Because Mercedes are not going to give him a car to do that. I mean, imagine if Lewis pulls off an 8-4 title at Ferrari, like honestly, at Ferrari as well, where of course Michael Schumacher won most of his 7, right? The guy whose record he matches right now. I mean, that would just be ridiculous. That story arc would just be excessively vibes. I mean, the Abu Dhabi 21 movie is already going to be sick whenever it comes out, right? But imagine then the second part, maybe the second movie, Lewis has had this and he comes back and he had all this difficult time at Mercedes, and then he goes to Ferrari, the Scuderia, and wins. Beats Charles Leclerc, right? Beats Max, beats everyone. Come on, it writes itself. And especially, again, he'll be 40 when 2025 comes along. This is the last move of his career, and his days in the sport are numbered. when your driver is still operating, you know, in the sport in their 40s, this question is going to rear its head again and again and again and again about the age, right? Ask any Fernando Alonso fan and they will tell you, as soon as Fernando hit 40, every single time, people like me are talking about when he might retire in my predictions videos or whatever, right? And it's probably really bloody annoying, fair enough. To be performing into your 40s on merit at the top tier of Formula One has to deserve huge plaudits, right? And Fernando, of course, is a particularly egregious example of that because he's 43, for crying out loud. Typically, this is a younguns game where you get out in your mid-30s. I mean, Vettel retired at 35, Webber at 37, Button at 36, Massa at 36, Rosberg at 31, and of course, Magnussen and Bottas are both out of seats next season, might never return to F1, and if they don't, they will have ended their careers at 32 and 35 respectively. Of recent times, Raikkonen, Alonso and Hamilton have been exceptions to, not the rule. And actually I think it's worth looking at Kimi for a few answers here as to why Lewis's form has seemed to dip potentially, right? Because even the most naturally gifted F1 driver of all time was not immune to the effects of age. Now, he spoke to the race after the 2021 season, finished post hanging up his gloves, of course. And when reflecting on his earlier career at Ferrari and Lotus, he had this to say: "I'm sure I was driving better when I was younger, but maybe not too young than I am now. I still race now, but I'm sure I was better at qualifying than I am now, but I would expect that." In the twilight of his career at Alfa Romeo, it was pretty common to see Kimi struggling in qualifying, but making up for it with his impeccable racing IQ. Apart from when he just randomly drove into Giovinazzi in Portimao and Seb in Austria. Apart from them two, really good. He was still a consistent, impeccable racing driver where managing your fuel load, tyre wear and strategy come to the fore. But his ultimate one-lap pace, where your optimum reactions and sensitivity to the car are most tested, they had undoubtedly declined, and he said it himself. Correlation does not always equal causation, okay? Very important thing to consider and remember just in life generally. But does it track? Is it just a coincidence that 39 years of age, Lewis is 16.5 down in head-to-head qualifying against Russell? The gaps aren't always massive, but George pretty consistently has got the edge on Lewis, right? And Lewis has admitted it, and he's put his hands up and said it's not been good enough himself. Speaking last year after Suzuka qualifying, Lewis said his qualifying has been the last 2 years. And I mean, this third year with George as his teammate has probably been Lewis's worst head-to-head, using George as a qualifying reference anyway. Age is just a number, right? And all athletes are going to feel the effects of aging differently. But it's something that's coming for everyone, right? The hairline's going for me, hence why I wear caps all the time, which probably actually speeds up the rate of decline, but there you go. And greys are coming in. I don't mind going grey, to be honest. I just want to keep my hair. And look, honestly, whenever someone asks me if Lewis Hamilton is at his prime, I quite quickly say, I don't think so. I think that's a huge ask for an athlete at 39 in a car that just doesn't work for him. To say Lewis is still at his prime now, to me, undermines what he's achieved in his career and the levels he has gone on to reach, right? It's always going to tail off eventually. He joined the sport at 22. To expect him to be at his absolute peak, to his peak, 100% his peak, he will never get any better than this. At 39, 17 years later, I don't see it. In ground effect cars that he doesn't like anywhere near as much as generations before. And by the way, I'll say exactly the same about Fernando Alonso. I don't believe Fernando Alonso at his peak any longer. No, I don't think he's at that top level. I still think he's a top driver. Maybe he's at 97, 98% of his peak, but I don't think he's at his peak anymore at 43. Of course, no. But look, where do you define a driver's peak, all right? Was it when Lewis Hamilton was wiping the floor with everyone? Or maybe his peak was during the Seb years, where Seb was dominating and we just never got to see Lewis's peak get celebrated because he wasn't in as good a car as Seb had. It's hard to say, right? I don't know. In part, I actually reckon 2021, I think that year pushed Lewis to places that he'd never been pushed before as a driver, actually. Just how visceral and how intense that fight became. I feel like that brought out a side, a competitiveness in Lewis I don't think we'd ever seen previously. And look, Lewis has driven a number of different cars over multiple different regulation cycles. And you know what? Maybe that's the problem. Because we kind of end up going full circle here, talking about the car again, but not the W15 specifically. More about these general ground effect regulations. We've seen it time and time again. Drivers with great CVs undone by a switch in team sometimes, but also sometimes it's just a switch in regulations. I mean, look at Sebastian between 2013, where he had one of the most dominant seasons of all time, and 2014, where he just wasn't at it. Lewis only has one point of reference in this ground effect era, which is the Mercedes, which has continually struggled. But perhaps even in the Ferrari, he just doesn't vibe with this kind of quite fat and heavy, long wheelbase, ground effect, very, very smooth approach needed car, right? I think there's a good reference to look back to Lewis and Jensen back in the McLaren days. They had very, very different ways of driving the same car. Jensen was super, super smooth with his inputs, his steering, and his throttle and his brake, right? He was the smoothest of operators. Carlos would have been a big fan. Lewis, on the other hand, was much more stabby with his inputs and his pedals, and would manhandle the car around, right? He'd poke the bear to make it dance for him. Yet over those 3 seasons, they were teammates at McLaren. I mean, you look at the points that they both scored, and it was pretty close, right? Probably Lewis was better overall, but there wasn't much in it. Yet nowadays, when you hear from drivers what is needed for these ground effect cars, right, where you want to keep that platform as level as possible, the reason anti-dive exists in the suspension is to stop the nose pitching down and the back pitching up, because that then stops the floor being level with the ground, right? You want to keep that as level as possible as often as you can to extract the maximum amount of downforce from that floor, which is the most powerful aerodynamic device in these cars. I think Checo, I think Daniel Ricciardo, I think Sebastian Vettel are all examples of drivers who had their peak years prior to ground effect, and since going into ground effects have all to varying degrees, I think, struggled. And Checo, maybe it is just Red Bull, but maybe he just doesn't vibe with ground effects. Like, it's hard to say because there's only one point of reference for him and Seb, but maybe. Now, of course, that isn't a rule for everyone. Like, Hulkenberg has driven loads of cars and is adapted and is doing bits in ground effect car machinery right now. I think he's really proven it. Science, Alonso as well. I think when Alonso had a competitive Aston Martin, like, he was right up there knocking on the door. But that makes it even more difficult to categorize what camp Lewis is in, right? Because yeah, Lewis has had an odd great moment in a ground effect car. Is that consistent enough to really be able to say with absolute certainty that he can get the best of himself in these cars? I don't know. I think we'll really learn that at Ferrari, because we know where Ferrari is. We know it's a competitive car. We know what Charles and we know what Carlos can do with it. What can Lewis do with it? And maybe that lack of consistency from some of the old guard drivers is what is pushing teams towards guys like Behrman, Doohan, Antonelli, Bortoleto now, Sauber, Lawson. These youngsters coming in knowing nothing else of the previous generation, these big ground effect cars, this is what they're learning in. This is going to be their first shot at Formula One and what they're going to inherently build their natural style towards. Versus a lot of the old guard who are having to kind of unlearn previously established habits to relearn new ones. And Lewis is about as old guard as it gets. Let me know in the comments below, how will Lewis fare against Charles Leclerc in a Ferrari over qualifying and races in 2025? Honestly, I'm worried for Lewis if I had to put money on it. I think qualifying, it won't be pretty. And even in the races, I think Charles is an incredible racing driver, great on the tyres, great wheel to wheel. Look, give me some hope in the comments below, because I really don't want this to be a damp squib end to Lewis's career in Formula One, but I need some convincing here, because I'm struggling right now. A career as iconic as Lewis's deserves to go out with a bang. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.